Welcome to the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. Matthew Smith, architect extraordinaire. And I got to say, it's interesting, the synchronicity. We spoke on a Synchro Wisdom Dialogue. You're the third guest, I believe, or second guest I had on the Synchro Wisdom Dialogue. And your email is new architecture. And a lot of this synchronicity really kicked up when my girlfriend and I found Peter Shampoo's book. And we just happened to speak to Peter Shampoo last night. And one of the things that we found out from Peter in his book and some of the research I've done is that the concept of the new arc, right, is really ingrained in the psychology of the colonies and how they were founded. And the town of Newark, nobody really pronounces it the way we are right now, Newark, but Newark, New Jersey, was founded with that idea in mind, and that's why it was named Newark, to be the new ark. And the people that founded Newark, New Jersey, they originally lived in New Haven, Connecticut. So I found that really synchronistic for us, being from this area and fascinated with the New Haven stuff. So before I go on a big diatribe about that, tell us about yourself, man, and what brought you here, not just, listening to my show, but like what got you started into this vein of interests and metaphysics and how they interact with architecture.
Well, it's fascinating that you bring up that email. That's an old email that goes back to my time living and studying architecture in Newark, New Jersey.
Wow.
And there's a book by Le Corbusier called The Modern Architect, called Towards a New Architecture. And at that time, I was very enamored with modern architecture, the Bauhaus School, so forth. I went to school at New Jersey Institute of Technology in Newark. So Towards a New Architecture, I thought that sounded pretty cool. And I was there in Newark. And so I kind of picked up on that. So that stuck, New Architecture with a K. And interestingly, at that time, I was working with this pretty radical poet, Amiri Baraka, who has deep roots. His family, the Baraka family, has deep roots in Newark. And he has connections back to Black Panther Party. He was sort of in a parallel political movement during those times. He was a beatnik poet, friends with Allen Ginsberg, and he's from Newark. And his son Raz Baraka is now the mayor of Newark. And so for much of the latter half of the 90s into the 2000s, I worked with their family on different grassroots political campaigns. But specifically with Amiri, I was involved with some grassroots urban renewal programs. Lincoln Park Coast Cultural District comes to mind. And he was really focused on Lincoln Park, the Coast Cultural District. It's an old jazz district. So Newark apparently was, at that time, back in the 60s, 70s, it was a jazz hub. There was a few places in the United States that were considered, like the epicenter of the jazz world, and Newark was one of them. So that was the coast. They called it the coast. And looking back on it, it's just so interesting. There were a lot of old red brick buildings that were, at the time I was there, was in early to mid 2000s studying architecture. And I would go around with him looking at these buildings, and he would tell me stories about who played where. And so he was really trying to spearhead this movement to rehabilitate Newark through the cultural arts and through giving new life to that legacy. So he had this handle. He used to talk about Newark being a new arc. And so he pronounced it this way as well. So, you know, and I don't want to get too far ahead, because where I would like to go with this conversation is back to those red brick buildings. I see them in a very different light right now, but at the time that I was living in Newark, a lot of them were being torn down, and I just kind of, it made a big impression on me that they were losing this beautiful old world building stock still at that time, and it's for lack of upkeep. You know, things were just not kept up and maintained, and instead of making rehabilitate them, they would tear them down. So as it turns out, there's a long, much deeper history to that than I had any idea about at the time. But I did grow up outside of Newark. I spent my childhood in a town called Nutley. It was right down Route 21 from Newark, and I have some pretty distinct memories of driving into Newark, just going to the airport or something, and looking up and from our station wagon and seeing project buildings, and realizing like, well, not everybody lives like I do out here in Nutley, and it made a big impression on me. And so in many ways sowed seeds of wanting to build a better world, like wondering to myself as a little kid, like, why do some people live this way and some people live, a wholly different way, and we're just right down the street from each other, and so I carried that with me into my adulthood, and into finally going to school to get my architecture degree. I wanted to come out of school, and what my goal was at that time was to get involved with low-income housing. And I believed I had a very kind of utopian ideal that, you could, if you wanted to, you could just build better houses for working class people and build a better world. And so while I was studying architecture, I was also very involved, as I said, in grassroots work. And my goal, again, at that time was to bring those worlds together. So that didn't exactly work out as I had thought it would. Mm. And what I found was that those opportunities weren't really there because the political will wasn't there. Our economy is not set up for building, glorious housing for poor people and so forth. I eventually moved out to Seattle just to start a family and to start my architecture career. And this was in 2004. And 2005, Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans. And so I was still pretty active at that time. And I was involved with an organization called Architects, Designers, and Planners. It was an ADPSR, Architects, Designers, Planners. Sorry that it's escaping me right now. For social responsibility. There it is. Mm. And so I spearheaded that organization's effort to lend a hand to the recovery effort in New Orleans. And so I went down there, and the architects that were involved with that organization, it was a national group, and they were very well intended, but they didn't really have an idea of how to proceed, how do professional architects help in a situation where there's this, catastrophe, and there's, people are just trying to meet their basic needs. And so there's this sort of tendency to approach everything through better design. But what does that look like in this kind of a situation? And so my idea was, well, with my, grassroots organizing background, I said, well, why don't I just go down there and meet people and find the organizations that are actually doing this kind of work, and doing the recovery work, and then asking them what they need. And so that's what I did. I went down, and the organization flew me down there, and I spent some time, and I dug around, and I found the leaders of the community, and that were leading these efforts, and it was an extraordinary experience. I remember the East Ward was just devastated, and there was a group of kind of like anarchists that took over an intersection and just established themselves and started, basically, they planted themselves there, and they were working with the community members, and they just started renovating houses. They didn't ask anybody's permission. There were no inspectors coming around. They just got in there and inserted themselves, built relationships, and lived in what looked like a war zone. And that was incredibly inspirational. And at the same time, that gap between a more like a formal institutional response that was helpful to the community and what the actual community was doing, that gap just seemed insurmountable. And so in some ways it was incredibly inspirational. In other ways it left me feeling more despondent than ever, and feeling like whatever changes need to be made in order to sort of achieve this utopian vision that I had for so many years, those changes weren't going to come soon, and they're not going to come easily. And so I started to pull back a little bit. I had at this time had a family that I needed to focus on. I have 3 sons, and I'm very involved with their lives. And at the same time, I wanted to be a builder and a doer, maker. I wanted to create. I tried my hand at architecture in the profession proper in Seattle, and it just seemed I didn't fit. It was very, very technocratic, and so I found myself just kind of leaving one job after another. And 2008 rolled around. There was the housing crash that happened at that time, and I was working for a custom residential architect, and the projects we were working on just pretty much bottomed out because of the economic situation. And I found myself once again just kind of on my own, starting over, looking around and figuring out what to do. And I guess long story short is my wife and I, we got out of the city, out of Seattle, picked up 1/3 of an acre in the woods on the Olympic Peninsula, and we had access to a 40-foot trailer, which was just completely run down. So I renovated this trailer and moved into it and lived on this land out in the woods and raising our little kids, and decided that we were going to build a yurt. And here in the Northwest, the yurts are pretty common, but the building departments don't like them too much because they don't want people living in what they consider a temporary structure that doesn't meet energy codes and so forth. And so they frown upon that, and it's hard to get a permit. We knew somebody that lived in one with his family, and they got kicked out by the county. And so then I found out about, just through a conversation with a friend, passing conversation, I found out about these wooden yurt structures that were being manufactured in Washington State as prefabricated kits. And I thought that sounded pretty cool. So I looked into it, and lo and behold, they're there in the Methow Valley. wooden yurts, just like it sounds, but made out of 2x6 studs, plywood, metal roofs, and basically really stout structures. And so I started designing my first wooden yurt house, and we took about 3 years living in this trailer in the woods, and built this house, and it turned out beautifully. And it turned it, at the time, it was the biggest structure that this company produced. The exterior walls were 14 foot tall, it's a 35 foot diameter, so it's basically a giant conical vaulted structure. And then tricked out the interior, built wraparound porches and a small addition on it. And they really liked the work that I was doing on that project, so they started feeding me other clients. I designed and built a couple more out on the islands in the Puget Sound, and then I started getting design clients and more, and pretty soon I was done building and I was full-time designing. And so I've been doing that ever since. And at this point, I've designed well over 100 of these structures all over the country. And I love it. They're absolutely wonderful structures. They make beautiful homes. Everybody that ever goes into one ends up smiling. It's just this really nice vibration that they carry. And so through the process of designing and building these houses and working with clients everybody who ends up building one of these has an interesting story, their own journey that's led them to this decision to get away from rectilinear houses and kind of get out into nature and live in the round. And so I've seen it over and over again. It has a very sort of transformative quality to it. And so for years, I've been kind of scratching my head about that and wondering, what is it? What's that special quality that these structures carry? And so more and more, what occurred to me is there actually is a vibration. The structures carry a vibration, they carry an energy. And I attribute that to the pure physical quality to them. You have walls in the round. Up at the top of the walls and at the base of the rafters, you have steel tension cables holding it in. And at the top, there's a giant compression ring where you'll have 50 or however many rafters going around in a spiral. The rafters are pushing into this compression ring and pushing out on the steel tension cables. And so it's like a drum. And so when you're in there, you hear the echo, you feel the vibration, you can feel it inside your body. And so all of this experience has led me to really think about structures in this way, to think about sacred structures. It's not just the religion, let's say, or the faith within a church or a temple. It's actually the building itself that's carrying, a container in a physical form, a container of something that's deeply profound, and it's led me into some really interesting areas of research.
I love that, man. Wow. Thank you for giving us the long and short of it. And I am gonna assume that the yurt behind you was designed by you. Is that correct? Is this a photo of a yurt you've designed yourself, or is this just a random photo you found online?
No, well, it is online, but it's the first one that I designed and built.
I had a feeling.
My family house.
Yeah, it looks incredible, and I've been sort of marveling at it as you've been describing this, and the way you put it, like a drum, where the tension is being exchanged between that compression ring, the steel cables, and the shape and the structure of the building itself. That's really incredible. I almost wonder if maybe you could like skin, put some skin at the top of that compression ring and figure out a way where, you have some device that hits it. I know it's all the way up at the top of the ceiling, but that'd be kind of cool to have a drum built into the ceiling of your living space.
I've kind of done that.
Yeah? Oh, wow. Tell us about it.
Well, just, in the process of building it before you put the roofing on.
Right.
You have all these exposed rafters with that 5-foot compression ring all open. And yeah, man, you can play it like an instrument for sure.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'd love to see a video of that if you have it. But I'm curious how much of the landscape is factored in when you're designing something, because when I'm looking at this yurt behind you, I notice that there's sort of a walkway that goes over water. You're sort of letting the water flow past the structure itself. Like, are you taking into account these things, the direction of the sun as it passes over the yurt, and how important are those natural landscape features to selecting a location to start building?
Yeah, completely site specific. They don't have to be. You could build a beautiful structure, without taking all of that into account. But when you take that into account, you take the orientation of the views of the path of the sun, natural features. It starts to resonate with the environment itself. Right. And so for this site, this is a winter creek that fills up after the snow melt. And so it springs to life for a couple of months a year. And it was in that boardwalk that goes over, it leads to a pavilion that was deeper in the woods. And so it took a number of years to shape the land and work around it. We really went through a process of getting to know the land. It wasn't like right away we knew exactly how everything was going to go. It's like we built the house and lived there and got to know the features of the land, got to know the climate. So it was a dialogue that evolved over a period of years.
Right. Now, you mentioned when you're talking about the zoning permits and whatnot, they consider these temporary structures. Is that a sort of just like, bureaucratic mumbo jumbo, or do these things actually like last a certain amount of time, right? Because I grew up in a house that was built in the early 1800s, and it wasn't. My dad did a lot of work to make that thing, up to spec so that it was a livable place. Before we moved in, when I was very young, an old lady had been living there for almost a century, and it was just like, the way she had it when she first bought it. It was, totally a relic. So I would argue that most of our structures aren't very permanent to begin with. So what qualifies this as a permanent or temporary?
Right. So just to be clear, so this is a permanent structure, considered permanent. It'll last for as long as any house would last. The temporary structures were the canvas type yurts that inspired this.
Right. Okay.
So those are the ones that are popular out here because they're relatively affordable. They're perfectly good structures, and if I could have, I would have lived in one because it would have been a lot. I wouldn't have had to get a mortgage. For one, you can deal with the maybe the lack of insulation by using a wood burning stove and what have you in those structures. But those are the ones that are considered temporary structures by building departments. These structures meet all the building codes, all the energy codes, and so forth. But as far as like the codes go, this is where I don't get along with the architecture profession as such, because living close to Seattle, I see what they're doing with the development. It's just like rapid development, office buildings and condos, and tearing out old housing stock and just kind of stripping this area, this city, of its character, and introducing a lot of stresses in the process. And so a lot of the structures, especially the condo development, they kind of sell it as densification, and so that's supposed to be sustainable and affordable. But I don't think it's either of those things. What they end up doing is they end up designing these big corporate developers come in and they end up designing condos, maxing out the building envelope according to what's allowed by the zoning codes. And they basically, if you look at them, they look like zoning code, graphics, they're the sort of antithesis of, a resonant structure, a structure with,
right,
vibration. And,
well, it's all about, maximum, profit, minimum waste, right? So they're just, and by waste I mean not wasted materials, but wasted space, right? So they're trying to fill up as much space as possible with as many people in those limited confines that they have to build. And I've seen some really ugly ones. We used to have a beautiful quarry on Route 67 in Connecticut, these huge, massive pieces of granite, and they cored it all out, pulled it out, and now there's this like monstrosity of a condo. It's like half shopping mall, half condo, where these people like live, basically in a shopping mall. And it's, I get the appeal, but not my style, and it totally dampens the energy of that route. It used to be sort of like a magnetic spot that you'd drive by, all these big rocks, you'd feel their presence, they were close to the road, and now they're just like gutted. There's probably one shard of granite left that they have like on its axis is like a sort of structure or a statue of some sort. But yeah, it doesn't seem like they're taking into account the energy of the land. And you mentioned the red bricks. I know we're going to spend some time talking about that, but it does seem like, here, you're from New Jersey, so you probably have a similar nostalgia for this sort of thing, but you have a certain feeling when you're in a neighborhood where there's Victorian, like very ornate buildings, like they shine. They're poking out at you like, hey, look at me, compared to these like plain, flat-faced, shingled houses that you have everywhere now, and even worse is sort of concrete structures that are all very brutal looking. But yeah, it's unique to be in a place like New England or even New Jersey where those structures are still at least around in the historic areas. I imagine out in the West, I've never been to Washington or anywhere out there, but I imagine it must be a little different.
Well, yeah, I mean, what's interesting about Seattle, or was interesting for me coming here from the New York City area, is how new it is. It feels very new in terms of, the urban development and so forth. But that said, there's some old buildings out here that kind of, raise a lot of questions. And Seattle has a very strange history too. And I don't know if you've heard about Seattle's underground city.
No, you know what? We've done an episode on my other podcast, Esoteric America, about Seattle, but we spent the majority of the time talking about the Native American cultures there, and then we spent a little bit of time at the end talking about the fires that took place there. But I'm fascinated. I think there's certainly, I mean, I've heard of the, in Portland, they have those tunnels that go out to where the docks are, and you get shanghaied and sent to China. That's where that comes from. But I imagine Seattle's similar. How deep does it go underneath Seattle?
Well, when I first moved here 17 years ago, I took a tour of this underground Seattle, and it was a curiosity at the time, and I didn't think too much of it, although it just seemed odd that you go down a stair through a lock gate from the downtown street level, and you enter another downtown below grade, and you can walk down a street with a sidewalk and storefronts that are brick-faced storefronts, and they even have some of the signage is still there
from the time period.
Yeah, and so the story goes that they finished building the city and then realized it floods, so they decided to rebuild it a story higher. They rebuilt the street grade, they raised everything, and it just was always like this curiosity, but strange, and like, that doesn't sound right, but okay. Yeah, and then I find out that cities like Chicago have a very similar story, with a little bit of a twist, where Chicago, was swampy, and so they decided after they were done building it that they were going to raise all of the buildings, physically lift the buildings off the ground and build new foundations under them. So those stories, like, the more you kind of scratch the surface of American cities, those really strange stories start piling up. Yeah, and to add into that, like you mentioned, fires. It took me, I spent 6 years in formal architecture, school at the university level, and you hear about the Chicago fire. I heard about the Seattle fire when I moved out here, but what I didn't know about was that, like, every city in the United States seems to have burnt down at some point in the 1800s and into the 1900s, and went through some major reconstruction. And so that kind of gets into a whole nother area of curiosity. And it's like at a certain point you pull back and you're like, well, what do you do with this information? What do you do with the knowledge that, the stories that were presented as far as, how our nation has developed and how it grew, don't exactly add up. Can you pause?
Yeah. We could pause if you got something. Go ahead.
Really? Spanish. Yeah, my wife's Bluetooth speakers were jumping.
Ah, okay. No worries. We just marked that on the timestamp and paused the recording, so we're good to go. I'll edit that out from the audio. Okay,
great.
Yeah. You're talking about the strangeness of these fires and learning about how they happened in more places than you'd expect, and then you were segueing into how you heard about this stuff through your courses at architecture school, but you didn't quite realize the scope of it, maybe?
Yes. So again, I come to find out that most American cities at some point or another in the 1800s and the 1900s burned down. And typically the fires were concentrated on, like business districts, financial core, financial center.
Places where they had a lot of insurance.
A lot of insurance, but also a lot of records is what I surmise.
Even more. Yeah, okay.
Uh-huh. And because who owns what? What's the history of a city?
Right.
Ownership is a big deal. And so, and if I jump off into too many directions, just rein me in, because
I'm with you.
It's a big rabbit hole.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I'm not sure how much of my stance on Tartaria you've heard, but I'm typically a little more skeptical than the majority of people, I think, that talk about Tartaria, mostly because I'm more of a generalist. I'm dealing with a lot of different topics. That's not my specific focus, Tartaria, but it fascinates me. My biggest suspicions are where the Native Americans are involved, because if Tartaria existed here in America, they were a part of it somehow. They must have been, right? So I'm all for it if they're included, but I get a little disenchanted when they're not. But anyways, I'm saying too much. I'm saying too much. I'll keep you I'll keep you on track.
Jumped into the deep end, so this is good. And you said the T word first. So I avoid that term.
Old world is the more appropriate term. I agree. I think that
like
makes
the term
sense.
old world. Cool. Increasingly I'm using the term analog world. Right? Because Tartare, it's like I don't know. Like I'm just trying to figure out what was there.
Right.
And I don't know who is responsible. I can't attribute it to this or that unknown civilization that is on the maps on the other side of the world at a different time in the past. Like that's to me, that's a bridge too far.
Right.
And I'm not saying it's not, I just don't know that it is. And it seems a distraction to me. So I try to let the buildings speak for themselves. I try to look squarely at things that we do know. We know that I know that I can go downtown Seattle and that there's an underground, and then the story that they kind of overlaid seems a little bit silly. Doesn't make sense that they would finish a city and then raise the street level, a whole story, and then start over as soon as they finish. Like, it's a lot of work to build a city.
Right.
Why would you want to do it twice? It seems silly to me that they.
Well, even the idea of lifting a building and like that seems like a heroic feat. How did they even pull that? How do you even pull that off?
An entire city of buildings. And then again, it's like we know, or we can point to documentation. There's photographic evidence of these great fires. The San Francisco fire, certainly the Chicago fire. New York City had a fire. I mean, you can go down a long list of cities that burned to the ground for one reason or another. So I just like to look at what we can put our hands on. And so for me, again, it's I've come to the conclusion that there was an old world civilization here in what is now the United States. And maybe it was the United States, but an earlier iteration before much of it got destroyed or dismantled. And I've also found out through my own independent research that, and speaking back to what materials were used to build things, what do we use to build things with, and what impact does that have on the life of the building? A lot of the old world buildings were built with a very different set of materials than the modern, I'd say the modern age buildings. And to me, the big line of demarcation between the old world and the new is it's the advent of modernity. It's what we refer to as the Industrial Revolution. It's when they started running electricity through wires going from a power plant to, a user by way of a meter that can be quantified and controlled.
Well, possibly, in other words, when they began to centralize everything, right? I mean, that's what these electric wire grids were really all about, was connecting all the power grids so they'd be in one system instead of a bunch of independent systems, right? I think the West Coast and the East Coast are both on their own respective grids, and Texas has its own grid. But I think like the power companies here, at least in New England, they all started as local power companies. They'd build a power station on the river, generate electricity, and share it with just the local area, right? Mm-hmm. So there came a point when they sort of connected them all. Is this what you're describing, like the centralization, the homogenization of our society and our infrastructure?
In part, I think that's part of the process of, yes, increasing centralization within the modern era. But the point at which they divorce themselves from this old world, that's the point that I'm really interested in. And again, what do we call it? I don't need to really call it anything. I'm just kind of interested in the thing itself. So I want to show you this book I've got. Does this show up? American Cements by Elijah Cummings.
Yeah, when it's in front of your shoulder, it comes up. American Cements.
Yes. So this book was written in 1898.
Okay.
And this book was put together by this fellow, Uriah Cummings, where he chronicles, there's 300 pages of like a deep dive into the nature of cement. And so what he lays out here is that the old world was built with what they call it's natural cement. It's an American rock cement. So you talk about the granite quarries that you pass, and it had a certain feeling to it, right? There's a certain vibe, and now they put these ticky-tacky structures up, and the vibe goes down. My contention is that that's real. That's not just, that you have a certain aesthetic sense. That may be true. What's there is ugly versus the granite boulders that were, the outcroppings were beautiful. That is also true, but there's actual vibration to it.
I'm sensing something. It's not just like perspective. It's not subjective. There's an objective truth there.
Correct. It's the same vibration, the same type of feeling of walking into one of these round structures versus maybe a boxy house. Yeah. You're feeling a vibration. So what he lays out, so first of all, in this book, he goes through and he chronicles all of these natural rock quarries all over the United States. One in particular that I visited in the Catskills, it's called the Rosendale Mine. And it's a vast system of quarries, underground mines that apparently it's a 32 square mile area of underground mines. I mean, it's just massive. And I just went into a small piece of it. You can visit it. And so inside, what I felt like when I walked into this cavernous space was that this was a very ancient place. That's what I sensed. I felt like this was a very, very ancient place. The ceilings of the mines were maybe like 30 feet tall. And it's called, the quarrying technique is called room and pillar. So where you're scooping out a room and you're leaving columns. So it's really interesting because in sort of modern geological engineering, when you're doing this technique, they allow for a removal of 60% of the material, and you have to leave 40% in these structural columns holding up the roof of the mine. In the Rosendale mine, it's considered an engineering marvel because they've removed upwards of 90% of the material and left only 10% in terms of these columns. And in some cases, they've done it at extreme angles, which increases the physical load even more.
Wow.
So it sort of defies like conventional geological engineering. And they did this in a time during the 1800s when we didn't even have, the level of, material science that we do now. So he compiles a list of not all, but many of the buildings in the United States that were produced with this particular kind of cement. And when I refer to the cement, I'm not talking about the bricks or the stone. This is the mortar. This is the glue that's holding it together. And so the buildings that are attributed to this cement, and again, he put this list together in 1898. They're all the buildings that we look at in pictures and go, holy cow, look at that, it's so beautiful. There's the base of the Statue of Liberty, there's the Brooklyn Bridge, there's the United States Capitol building. There's, interestingly enough, the old patent office. We talked about record keeping and what happens to records in city conflagrations. the old patent office is on his list. And in 1877, the patent office, the United States Patent Office, burned down for the second time. It burned down once in 1830 or 1835, taking all of the records of patents that, you know, form the foundation of, you know, scientific advancement in the United States at its very young age, and it burned to the ground, and all those records disappeared. And then they built a new building, or they inhabited, and they moved the office, and that building burned down again in 1877. So it's like all the records of whatever happened before were disappeared twice over, which is curious. So it's also curious to me that that building too was made with this particular cement. This cement, why I'm so enamored with it, other than the fact that it's sort of a roadmap to the old world, it has very special qualities. It's very distinct then from Portland cement. And Portland cement is sort of the material of the New World. Portland cement is made up of a bunch of stuff. It's kind of a conglomerate of different things. It has a lot of additives in it and so forth. Whereas this natural rock cement is just what it sounds like. It's natural rock. It's the rock that comes out of the ground. And just that. They run it through a process of superheating it, you know, pulverizing it, and then producing this cement with it. And what it essentially is calcium silicate. So calcium is, you know, the material that strengthens bones and so forth. Silicate, silicate is oxygen and silica. Silica is what quartz is made out of. And so where my mind is going with this is like, you know, I heard one of your previous guests talk about piezoelectric generation. And when I heard him mention that, a light bulb went off for me, because I keep thinking, like, you know, this research community likes to talk about, you know, red brick as like, you know, potential, you know, charge carrying, voltage carrying battery packs, right? I've heard that talked about, but I've never actually heard any kind of like hard, you know, science or, you know, anybody really pointing to how and why, other than red brick contains iron. So I get that. But with the actual mortar, and I have never really heard people talking about the mortar, the properties of the mortar. So if you have a mortar material that's made out of this natural cement that is half silica and half calcium, the silica portion it's quartz, right? It's quartz crystal. It's the same stuff that quartz crystal is made out of. And so we know that when you put quartz under compression, it produces voltage. It produces an electrical charge, right? It's the basis of radios. And I'm not an expert in any of this. I'm just kind of a lay person that likes to build roundhouses and make cool things with my hands. But so I'm, you know, and there's a lot of people that are looking at this question of the old world, and I feel like we're living in a time where, you know, there's a lot of talk of great reset and everything, and like changing things up again. But at the same time, there's a lot of really interesting research going on, looking back on what we had and where we came from, and rediscovering some things that we might have lost along the way. And so for me, again, it's like whatever we call it, when I consider the fact that a lot of these old, exquisite, old world buildings in these cities, many of which have been destroyed deliberately or lost by fire, some of which are still with us, thankfully, but that they're made with a material that under pressure actually emits or produces voltage or could carry a charge, that the buildings themselves could have an electrical property just by their being.
And this would be where certain structures, sacred structures, would hold the intention, so to speak, of the inhabitants, right? And maybe even act in a way where our houses today don't, as a conductor and a generator of these positive energy fields, instead of nullifying it. Like a lot of the materials in our houses today nullify a charge. They're like rubbery, you know, they sort of stop it where it is, and that's not a healthy state of being. You know, we're fluid, energetic beings, you know, that static energy that's everywhere around us is a big malcontributor to our health in a way, you know, depending on you know, where you look at it. Obviously diet and other things play a factor, but this is one of the lesser known aspects of our health that maybe we could find some proof by testing, you know, the health of an individual who lives in, you know, home A versus home B that has these types of materials integrated into the structure.
Yeah, you think about what a Faraday cage is, what it does. Like it can protect one from an external electrical, you know, charge, right? But it can also block good, you know, electromagnetic energy from reaching the inhabitants. Like my kids, my youngest boy goes to a middle school down the street here, and it's a brand new school, and we watched it being built, and the entire thing is steel studs. And I'm looking at this going up, I'm saying, geez, they're building a giant Faraday cage, right? And so it's going to block good electromagnetic charge from reaching all of these children. And then inside of it, you know, stuffing it full of EMF, Wi-Fi,
fluorescent lights, and oh man.
Yeah. So, yeah. And so I think all of that is very real. And you know, and then we can, you know, go down the rabbit hole of, you know, the list of sicknesses and ailments that some people attribute to the proliferation of 5G towers that suddenly showed up when we were being locked down for a couple of years. I just cracked this book. A friend shared this with me. Have you seen this book?
Yeah, I have it actually. I think I picked it up at the used bookstore a couple weeks ago. Yeah, it's on my shelf over there.
Yeah, well, it's a tome, and I'm a slow reader, The Invisible Rainbow. But I cracked it, and where it starts out is with the old railroad riders in the mid 1800s, and they used to get really sick. And the list of symptoms looks a lot like the symptoms that we've been seeing show up in the last couple, 2-3 years. And so what they point to is that they laid out the early electrical wires, telegraph wires, following the tracks that these trains ran along. And so the supposition is that, you know, when they cranked up these electrical wires and they're hovering over steel tracks, and, you know, and all these humans are inside these steel trains, they're basically being radiated and showing symptoms, again, that would become very familiar with. So, yeah, I think all of this is real, and it's demonstrable. And again, it's like, you know, we live in a modern epoch that divorced itself from an analog age that went back who knows how long. And again, it's like it's ironic that I still carry that email address, New Architecture, because Le Corbusier, he was one of the worst offenders as far as laying out this new modern, you know, era. And like, I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but, you know, just think of the projects, think of project buildings, the ones that I was referring to, you know, looking at when I was a little kid, driving with my parents to the Newark airport. Those modern tenement type structures were conceived of as a utopian scheme by people like Corbusier.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting how those ideas have this veil of good intention and ultimately fail at bringing that into fruition. It seems like they've created ghettos purposefully, places where people have so much A, competition, and B, lack of resources that they end up fighting each other instead of fighting what's oppressing them.
There's so many different aspects to it, and the part, and everybody's got to kind of pull an oar if we're going to get to a better place. And for myself, the oar that I'm trying to pull right now, the thing that I'm trying to learn more about and hopefully start communicating, and being on your podcast right now is really a part of me. It's like one of the first times I'm really coming out with these views. I'm really trying to look squarely at the types of buildings, the types of structures that we have had in the past, the types of structures that we've been building for the last, 150 years, and the types of structures that we're going to build to inhabit in the future. And I think by now there's enough information to look at and make a case for healing structures versus sick structures, structures that raise the vibration, and structures like projects that would just by their nature lower the vibration of the people living in them.
Right. I agree, and I'm glad that we have folks like yourself designing this new future and pulling an oar. I think you're spot on, and I'm glad to have this conversation here on this show. It's sure to inspire people, and I'm happy to be a part of that. And you mentioned something earlier about cement being sort of like a road, this particular type of cement being the roadmap. I'm assuming you're referring to how you can sort of trace where these buildings may be in relationship to this old world by whether or not they utilize this cement. Have you found many examples of this? Like, are there any interesting buildings that are worth mentioning? I mean, we can even possibly pull up some pictures here for the viewing audience.
Yeah, well, the building that really got me kind of cued onto this was the Fort Jefferson, which you've probably looked into a little bit. It's Fort Jefferson off the coast of the Florida Keys, and like the farthest reaches of that string of islands, way out in the middle of nowhere. And it's the largest. I think it's the largest uninhabited masonry structure in the United States, and it was supposedly built for military purposes. It's way out in the ocean and has 16 million bricks. And after they completed it, they decided that it wasn't very practical, so they didn't really use it. So that's the story. And it's, again, these stories, you start scratching the surface and they start not making sense. Right. So this building in the 70s was going through a restoration process. And this is the one, this is the project where they realized, hey, there's something wrong with what we're trying to do, because the chemical composition of the Portland cement-based mortar that they were trying to have adhere to this structure wasn't working. And chemically, concrete is, it's very sensitive chemically, and it's very particular, very specific, and you have to match like with like. And so, they investigated, and what they realized is that this is a different type of cement, that this, in fact, is put together with this natural American rock cement that came from Roslyn, New York, there in the Catskills.
Wow.
And so that now, since then, they've, there's been a resurgence of understanding that, hey, look, all these old world buildings have a unique makeup. And so there's a cottage industry now where they, reproduce some of these old cements And so they're used widely in historic preservation architecture, but not on a industrial scale. We're still using Portland cement for most of our structures now. Yeah, so there's actual if they have a fingerprint, so to speak.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's like a forensic type of science where you can trace things back, and yeah, that's incredible. So where do the red bricks fit into this? Can you trace them back to a sort of origin point, or is that a little more general? I mean, it seems like because I can remember playing with red bricks in my backyard as a kid. Like, my dad had just like a big pile of them because he cobbled his own driveway and, built a bunch of stuff in our backyard. So he's always been kind of that kind of guy who builds things himself. And I remember, when you're a kid, you get destructive. I take the bricks and slam them together and make this big loud noise. And sometimes there would be like sparks that would fly off. And I was a little bit of a trouble hellraiser, but that was kind of a unique memory of mine, is like playing with those bricks and like hearing the sound, like the very distinct like sound they would make when you'd clap them together.
Yeah, and so I haven't researched too much into it, except that with sort of a general knowledge, newer bricks seem to be a lot less dense than the older bricks. It's like the wood, like in the old structures. A lot of I grew up again in New Jersey, and so I grew up in a 100-year-old house, and the studs in that house were true 2x4 in a really dense grain. So it's just a different quality material than like the white spruce, 1.5 by 3.5 studs, really soft wood that we use to build houses nowadays. So the bricks, they're kind of similar, like at least in terms of their density. The farther back you go, it seems the stronger they are. The more pounds per square foot you'd have to apply to a brick to crush it.
Is this just a cost sort of thing where they're sort of trying to cut corners and cheapen things up, overall create more of an obsolete product that has to be replaced eventually? Is that the intention?
I mean, I think on some level, yeah, you'd have to conclude, we live, it's a disposable era that we're in, right? Everything is just, designed obsolescence, and it's no different with buildings. But on the other hand, I think that there are, they did things in such a way back in the days of the analog era. We've lost sight of, we've lost a certain knowledge. And I'm not saying that we can't reproduce those bricks. I don't know. I haven't researched it enough, but it's just that we don't make them like we used to.
Right. Yeah. The old adage is truer than you'd think. Yeah. We don't make them like we used to. So we've looked at this very odd structure out in the middle of the ocean there. We have to assume that this was all shipped in. Are there other examples, maybe mainland examples of, unexplained structures, maybe things that are too advanced for what we could build today? Because that's one of the big head scratchers, is like, oh, we couldn't build this today. How'd they do it back then? And you mentioned...
Well, look up the Stadium High School in Tacoma.
Okay.
This is one of my favorite ones. So here's this castle-looking building, and I think it's a total of 12 stories built into a hillside. Which I took a tour of this. You can there's a fellow down in Tacoma, Washington, that runs historical architectural tours of old Tacoma, and so he took us around this thing. It's built into a hillside, and another very strange story behind this, where it was built as a hotel and then never finished for whatever reason in the late 1800s. Then it was used for storage for a number of years before finally somebody came along and funded its completion, and then it became a high school. So, we're talking to this fellow about, where'd the bricks come from to make this thing? This is, the late 1800s. Did they ship them up from San Francisco? Was there a production facility down there? He said no. The bricks came from ballast weights in the ships bringing goods from China. I thought that's interesting. And if you look closely at the bricks, they're not just clinkers. They're like the kind of Roman bricks. They're very narrow. It's a high quality brick. And so I thought it was curious that the story goes that these were just ballast weights. So they bring the ship here, and ballast weights basically keeps the ship steady, right? And then when they get to port, they offload the goods that they've got on the top, and then they get rid of the ballast weights in the bottom that were helping to balance the ship out. So basically this was just like a disposable product is what he was saying, and they didn't know what to do with it. So they built this exquisite palatial high school with it, or hotel turned high school. But I look closely at the building, and if you look at the windows on the all over the building, they have arch topped to the windows. And I looked at the bricks around the arches, and the bricks were trapezoids. And that's not easy to do. Like each brick was itself a trapezoidal shape, creating the arches, structural arches above the window. So there again, I thought, and I don't know why I didn't say anything to him. I didn't want to take the wind out of his sails. Our historical guide there. But I thought that's not right. There's no way, there's no way that they went through all this trouble to make these exquisite trapezoidal bricks only to throw them in the bottom of a ship and discard them on some foreign shore. So there again, there's another story that's not apparent, and it's just part of the mystery of where these structures came from and who built them and when.
Yeah. And now for people who may not understand why that would be significant, is there a special technique that one would have to do to create a trapezoid brick? I mean, I guess it would be not an efficient way to do it, because you're taking like one chunk and you might have a bunch of scrap pieces, right? Because is that the idea, is that it wouldn't be a very efficient way to make bricks, so they wouldn't have gone and created this if they were merely meant to only be ballast weights, right? Because you don't need a special shape for a ballast weight.
That would be my guess, that there's just some form, just a special form. So they'd have to go out of the way to make a specific shape for a brick.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Makes sense. It's a mold. It's not carved. I don't know what I'm thinking. Carving bricks. But so we have Tacoma. We have Florida. When you went to New Orleans, I know we're kind of going back a little bit to a point where maybe you didn't recognize this stuff, right? You weren't sort of researching this back then, I assume. But since you've gotten into this stuff, have you noticed anything in New Orleans that's worth mentioning? Because New Orleans, I mean, that goes back all the way to the French initially, and they were in that city for a long time.
Yeah, at that time, and this is 2005, I wasn't looking at things through this lens. Other than New Orleans, a beautiful old world city that really seems out of place in the United States. It just, every time I've been there, it just seems like this is from a different place and different time, a different nation, almost different culture. So what actually stood out for me at that time, and I know I was getting down on building codes before and being sort of onerous, but at the same time, what stood out for me at that time was the houses that were built to code versus, to modern building codes, versus houses that weren't built to any kind of code. They were just kind of put together. the effect of the hurricane and the flooding on houses that were built to code. There was a lot of those buildings that lasted, and ones that were just kind of put together just got smashed to bits. And so that was the biggest takeaway for me as a young architect and builder at that time, was the importance of building codes. And also I do want to make a distinction between building codes, as I mentioned, that's like life safety stuff, versus the zoning codes. And the zoning codes are what, how big you can make the building and how close to the street front you can get. You're given sort of a zoning envelope that you can max out. So a little bit of a different animal there.
It does seem like New Orleans, to your point, is not part of the rest of the structure, but it is connected to this ley line that goes through Newark, New Jersey. So who knows? Maybe there's some synchronicity that carried you from one to the other.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, the ley line is called the Acadian ley line. Peter Shampoo also calls it the city ley line because of the amount of cities that are built on it. But from Mexico City to New Orleans to Atlanta to Washington, D.C., then Philadelphia, then through New Jersey, hitting through Newark, and obviously New York City because they're right next to each other, New Haven, Connecticut, and then Boston. You can draw a straight line through all those cities, and then that city on the globe curves and goes through Stonehenge and makes its way around the globe and then back to, Mexico City, and it crosses through several other interesting places globally that I don't have off the top of my head, but yeah, that's the city ley line.
So when they talk about ley lines, how is that measured? How is it? I understand that there's cities that you can string in a line, but how is it determined that there's a ley line there? Did Peter Shampoo explain this?
Yeah, he's looked at the Earth in a sort of what he calls gaiography, where there's a sort of living pattern that emerges, and the coincidence of those cities all being along that one linear point or linear axis is not a coincidence, is his essential theory. Whether or not he's like dowsed the ley line to determine that it's there, I don't think that that's necessarily even needed. It's just sort of evidential that people have built along this central axis and multiple different cultures as well. So what he's sort of talked about with the actual geometry of a ley line is that there's a central axis point, but then there's a sort of wave form, a positive and a negative wave form. So a ley line isn't necessarily one thin line, it's more of a band, and you'll have sort of positive and negative swings of that energy, and you'll have maybe certain structures in society that correspond to those negative and positive swings of energy, and you'll see certain cities arranged in such a way where it's almost like the north side is always affluent and the south side is always impoverished, right? Like this is sort of like built into certain cities using these energy structures, getting the flow of energy to sort of spin in a certain way, or understanding where it spins naturally and getting ahead of that by building, the affluent neighborhoods where the energy is at its peak.
I see.
And then when it reaches the south side of the city, it's already been dispensed. It's sort of, you're getting like the remains of it. So there's a few different dimensions to the ley line. It's think of it like a vine with a flower. The vine is a linear structure that's not completely linear, and then where it flowers is sort of like a spiral, a vortex, and even a circle. Yeah.
So interesting. So here, you've got all these different people and researchers pulling pieces together, and so I brought the mortar piece, and Peter Shampoo's bringing the ley line piece, and what's starting to emerge is this old world old world, the analog world, that we inhabited until relatively recently in human, in the course of human events. It had a natural resonance, like a building built with high energy materials in sort of like in a crystalline form, whether it's a dome or a vault, or in the case of sacred structures, you have a cathedral, which is basically like a crystal. It's right. You're building a cathedral like a crystal, so it's going to have vibration. And if it's built upon a ley line that is carrying this kind of positive energy in that particular spot, I mean, you can imagine the high energy, the resonance that's going to bring. And add to that, underneath the cathedral, maybe there's an underground current, water running, and then throw in a pipe organ with 40,000 intonations and a rose window, and man, you really got something there.
Right. Yeah, it seems this is the way our society used to flourish, and now we've been kept away from those finer aspects of energy and vibration, and left in this sort of situation where we're being sickened, we're being radiated, we're being not alleviated from these sort of entropies that are natural to certain parts of our environment. We're being exposed more to them. It seems like our structures used to shield us and offer some sort of reprise from that, and now we're just being bombarded on all fronts.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. I'd like to see a world where these structures are built with health in mind. Certainly, is there a way to scale this out? Like how far does your designing go? Do you like limit to just one building, or would you like to one day design like the way a city functions? Because I mean, cities, they're sort of like organisms. They have their separate parts, and there's a sort of flow of energy in these different directions. Have you considered maybe designing like a neighborhood or a city or something to that extent?
No, I'm focused on one house at a time right now. It's to me, it's too much. Like a city is an organism. It has to have an organic quality to it. And I think we've all seen examples of these, what they call ghost cities, like in China and
Southwest,
Uzbekistan or something. Like they build entire cities, and then they're just there.
Yes.
And everything is uniform, and I don't think that's the way a city develops or should develop. Urban planning, I took enough urban planning courses at the university level to just, I'm very skeptical, I guess, and I kind of hold it at arm's length. I think that it needs to be allowed to develop organically. So all I can manage, at least for myself, all I can manage is to do a house at a time, and just keep doing that work, and apply these principles where I can in my own work. And they're principles that inform my life. They're principles that inform how I want to be as a father. They're principles that inform how I'm going to interact with my neighbors, and just the kind of energy that I put out into the world. And as far as, the design aspect of it, again, it's a, like I'm cautious about the idea that you can change society through design. And again, I saw a lot of that sort of intention put into recovery efforts in New Orleans after Katrina, and where it didn't involve the community, and then where it did involve the community, they were, people were just kind of left to their own devices. So, but I do think that in order to develop cities, it has to start at the community level. I think communities have to be the heart, of that sort of scale of design. And at the heart of communities are families, and we live in an era where families are just under so much stress and strain that, I don't know, maybe good architecture just starts with strengthening families.
Right.
People having enough time and resources to just, improve their immediate environment.
Right. Right. And all of these things can be demonstrated if we have the right science. Like, you can show with these finer aspects of our scientific, maybe the newer aspects of science, or even the older aspect, the really ancient aspects of science, like cymatics and how to integrate these vibrations into the structure of a home, could have an immediate effect on the health of a family, like the same way you described that instant smile someone feels when they walk into your, roundhouse structure, your yurt structure. It's like an instant feeling of like, wow, okay, I'm here. This is nice. Maybe that's what we need more of, because, I'm just speaking from my family's perspective, but there's a very Discordian energy when everybody's compartmentalized in their own room and everything's segmented like that. If everybody was sort of rounded out, you could have your own space, but it's more communal that way. It's more integrative and inclusive.
Yes. Well, have you heard of the work of Tanya Harris?
No.
Speaking of cymatics. Tanya, Tanya Harris. It's the Architecture of Sound website, and she's gone into various cathedrals. I think in Ireland or England, I think, and she's run these experiments recording the ambient sound of these structures, absent of any kind of music or chatter, and just the silence of the sound, and just recording, and then distilling those sound recordings down further and further till it's like an audible hum that she then plays to a bowl of water, and then photographs the results. And she's coming up with these cymatic patterns that look like snowflakes or that look like rose windows. So I'm sure that we could go into any structure and conduct such an experiment and discover the ambient cymatic fingerprint of pretty much any structure. And that would be a fascinating experiment. Go into my kids' middle school made with steel studs down the street here and measure, and see what we come up with, or go into a cathedral nearby, or go into a cave, go into terms of actually dowsing for ley lines. I wonder if these kind of things can actually be discerned through such experimentation.
Yeah, no, it's one thing to see the pattern in the water, but then to consider that we are water beings, and that's going on inside of us potentially when we're in these structures. It brings a whole new light to it. And yeah, if only people could be shown that in a way that was not totally anti-authoritarian, because that's a big issue with a lot of these subjects, is people, they don't expect a guy like you with your amount of school and training and work in architecture to come in with anachronistic views to the system, because they've only been shown one way. And unfortunately, when people do come to this with anachronistic views, they get, silenced and pushed out of the market and asked to, not participate because they're shaking up the system. But I don't know if they're going to be able to pull that thing off for much longer, because it seems like we're waking up to these concepts on a massive level that's not happened before. You know, for worse or for better, the T word, Tartaria, has generated a lot of interest in this sort of subject, and whether or not, you know, there's another civilization that's responsible for these buildings, it really doesn't matter. The fact is that we're all human beings, and if they built it back then, we should be able to build it now, right? I mean, is that the intention? Yes. You hope to be able to bring these things back into fruition and show the examples of where they are still standing?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I would love to go back to your question earlier. I would love to participate in a project that you know, just scaled up a little bit, maybe taking several of these structures and putting them together in, you know, some kind of you know, resonant harmonic whole, where you have parts to the whole, and it's maybe even laid out in some kind of a, you know, crystalline type of plan. Maybe not at the city scale, but, you know, at the level of a complex would be extraordinary opportunity. But yeah, I mean, you know, this paradigm, this modern age of modernity that we're living in, I mean, it's, you know, I feel like we're kind of in the end game of this whole project, this whole way of doing things. It just seems like everywhere you turn, it's fallen apart. And so, you know, we're in the search of for a new story, like a new cosmology. I mean, even science itself, it just seems like it's played itself out. You know, it's just, you know, scientism is, you know, how a lot of people refer to it now. You know, the idea that the Big Bang never happened. It's just where that, you know, they'll explain everything, just grant them, you know, one free miracle. You know, so this paradigm that we're suffering through right now is in its end game, I think. And so out of you know, the rubble of the age that we are living through is going to emerge something new. And I think what is going to emerge is it's not gonna look just like what, you know, it was 200 years ago and previous. It's gonna look like something new. But there's principles and there's ideas, there's concepts that are eternal. And I think that they're there to be discovered, and they're there to be applied to whatever new expression is coming.
Right. So you mentioned in the notes that you have an ayahuasca experience under your belt, maybe more. How much of that fed into this, you know, new realization and this mission that you're on? Because I think the audience is really keyed in to ayahuasca. Me, I don't know if I'll ever do it. My girlfriend's done it. I've had many conversations with people who have done ayahuasca, but I'm curious, where does this sort of fit in? Like, when you had your ayahuasca experience, was it clear to you that this is a part of what you're meant to do, or did it get more personal than that? I mean, I mean, I've never experienced a trip, so I really don't have like the, you know, context to ask you from. But like, were you more inspired afterwards to stick with this, so to speak?
Yeah, yeah. My ayahuasca path it's deeply personal, and when I first got into it, it was a result of a series of crises, you know, life crises, where, you know, I just realized I needed to change things up. I needed to find a new way of being that didn't lead back to the same type of personal crisis. And usually these are health crises wrapped around renovating or building a house, where I just throw myself at these projects with abandon. And what I learned through the process of working with ayahuasca was that it's an old pattern for me that goes back to my childhood, growing up in an old house, 7 kids in my family, the old Irish Catholic, East Coast tribe. And I spent my childhood fixing up the house that kept falling down around us. So, so that act of building and remodeling and renovating was, both a therapy, a way for me to learn and develop skills, but it was also very much wrapped up in like my own trauma, my own, I guess trauma is the word.
Yeah.
And so what I realized was, and again, I went to ayahuasca after I injured myself for like the umpteenth time working on a house remodel for my family. What I realized was that I was just playing out old patterns, and I was going to keep playing out those old patterns until I saw it and, recognized it and learned not to do that. And so for me, that's the role that ayahuasca played. It was able to open my eyes to that patterning. And so I wouldn't advocate anybody to do ayahuasca. I mean, it's profound. It's like there was times where it was absolutely terrifying. And there was definitely times where I got into it and thought, why am I doing this to myself? It's exhausting at times. It can be really frightening. And then there's times where it's just like the most beautiful revelations came to me. But I saw the impact, the immediate impact, and then the ongoing impact it was having on my life, on how I conduct myself in the world, how I carry myself, the way I apply myself to my work, the way I am as a father and how I'm raising the kids. And, and again, it's like, what kind of parent do you want to be? Do you want to be like, still figuring out your childhood stuff while your kids are like becoming teenagers and you're just handing off your problems, unresolved issues to them for them to figure out someday maybe, or, here's an opportunity just to face things squarely and learn the lessons that you need to learn to be a better person, to be a better, father. And so, so that's what I chose for myself. And the deeper I got into it, and so now I've been doing it about 4 years. I've done a little over 50 ceremonies, and, I got really, really lucky getting into it. I just met the right people at the right time. And I didn't have to travel too far. I didn't have to go to Peru or Mexico. And so I was really fortunate. And so basically, I've had a mentor that I've been working with for the last couple of years, almost exclusively. And, he's a dear friend, and he's himself is, a really committed practitioner who's working with Shipibo people, and very, very committed to keeping his medicine clean, we say, and he's gone through a couple of year-long dietas. And so what that is when you enter into the space of working with the ayahuasca and you exclude certain other things from your life for that period of the dieta, including certain restrictions around nutrition and intake, types of music you listen to, types of movies you'll watch, even the company you'll keep. And it's, very kind of a, the path of an ascetic in some ways. And so he's doing all that heavy lifting. And so I've been able to, benefit from his level of commitment to working with the plant medicine. So again, I consider myself incredibly fortunate to be in the position I've been in, to work with it on that level and not having to travel too far. But what it's opened to me is an internal world that in many ways reflects all of these things that we're talking about externally. You know, I wish that there was a cathedral down the street where I can go. You know, I'm not religious anymore. I grew up Catholic, but, you know, and so I did go to church growing up, but I do wish there was such a building, such a sacred structure that I could enter into and feel, you know, enriched in this way and like cleansed and energetically healed and uplifted. And I think that's the role that these structures were playing in many regards. I don't have that, but I can enter into a space with this plant medicine where it's something very similar going on internally. The visionary space of it that it opens up often, to me, reflects like the inside of a cathedral, right? It's you know, very geometrical, has, you know, all this sort of sacred geometry. They're seeing, the practitioner, the shaman, is seeing to you his Icaros. And the Icaros are working with the plant medicine and creating vibration and frequency that the purpose of which is to clean your energy body. And so, you know, maybe up until like a few years ago, I would have considered a lot of this to be, you know, just a lot of woo. But going by what I've experienced and what I've seen, to me, it's just no longer a question if like these inner realms exist. It's what, you know, what do we do with the knowledge that our being is much more than meets the eye, than the physical plane, that there are other dimensions that we can access with caution,
right,
and potential peril if you're not careful,
right,
or if you get, you know, into it maybe with the wrong practitioner and the wrong, you know, setting, or with the wrong intention. And that's the other thing is that in the world of ayahuasca, intention is everything, right. And then integration is everything else. And so it's like the actual ceremony, the space of the ceremony is a container. You know, it's a very sacred container. You know, but there's a beginning, a middle, and the end. You enter into it with intention, and that's going to determine much of what you experience, because you're setting your own vibration, and you're meeting this powerful plant medicine, which is like profoundly wise in ways that we can't even begin to discern, because, you know, we don't have we're not innately with plant consciousness, but we can experience it through these mediums. So we set our intentions, we go in, the ceremony is held, it's opened, the Icaros occur, the cleansing process happens, and then the ceremony closes. And at the end of the ceremony, you're like, holy shit, what did I just see? You know, and you just had this like download. Just sometimes it's just absolutely overwhelming amount of stuff that gets downloaded, and it's like, what do I do with this? And then if you don't do anything with it, then it's just going to be like a dream you had that fades into the distance. And but through the practice of integration, you can bring these things into your life in such a way that the lessons that you've learned don't have to be relearned. Because sometimes it's painful to learn hard lessons. You know, I learned a lot of hard lessons, like, why do I keep creating chaos in order to just feel like I'm the guy that has to come and fix it. Well, because I grew up in a house that was falling down, and that's what I knew. So I kept creating chaos as an adult and spilling over into how I'm like being as a father and so forth. So those are some pretty tough lessons to learn. So I had to unlearn that, or learn how to conduct myself differently at this stage in my life. And so the next time I go into ceremony, I don't have to relearn that lesson because I've integrated it.
Absolutely, yeah. I love the comparison to a cathedral, and certain cathedrals are built in the proportions of a human body, so I would be excited to see what happens if somebody does ayahuasca in a cathedral or in a sacred space like that. I mean, what kind of profound experience could be had?
That's a good question, because also cathedrals, and churches and sacred buildings have also been used for not pure intent.
Right.
So I'd be cautious about being in a building that was maybe used for by various religions, because again, it's like the energetic imprint. It's all around us all of the time. It's just like our, this spectrum of light that we're able to see is just a sliver. So
I think there was in Manhattan, there was like a club that was built in St. Paul's Cathedral. Like, it was a cathedral that had gone defunct and was sold, and then these like young people who were in a music scene at the beginning, I forget which genre, but they took over this cathedral and they had all these parties there, and I think some television executives were even involved in kind of like poaching young people from this sort of group to recruit them to be a part of, whatever entertainment schemes they had. But yeah, I'd imagine there were a lot of drugs going on in there, and it definitely had a conspiratorial sort of reputation. I forget where I'm remembering that from. My mind's thinking St. Elmo's Fire, but I don't think that's the same thing. I think it's something unrelated. This might have been something I heard about on a comedy podcast. Comedians, they got a bunch of stories, not all of them you could follow up on, but yeah, the idea of doing a profound psychedelic like ayahuasca in a cathedral may be exciting at first, but I appreciate you coaching it with that, because you don't know what intentions have been built into that structure or placed into that structure throughout its history, right? It might have been built with good intentions, but if somebody was doing some dark magic in there, or maybe just the overall oppression energy, that'll seep into your consciousness. That'll affect your experience for sure.
Yeah, I mean, what if there's some crypt under the altar that you're not aware of? Or the energy's there,
right?
And there's, in a ayahuasca ceremony, the first thing that the shaman is going to do is they're going to clean the space, right? They're going to clean the ether around the ceremony itself. So I would feel the same way about like pyramids, they might be carrying some dark energies that you don't want to tangle up with. And again, it's, ayahuasca is one modality, and there's a lot of ways to climb the mountain. And so maybe if you build a powerful structure that's doing that job, that's a modality in itself. And so you don't need to be, tripping balls in church. Just play the pipe organ and be still.
Well, yeah, it seems like it's designed for that purpose. Well, when it comes to these old world structures, we've heard rumors of sound being a big component, and even like buildings that aren't religious or oriented for, sacred means, having big pipe organs in them, and maybe these things serve to sort of function beyond just being musical instruments. Have you looked into that at all, and looked into like the cathedral connection there?
I mean, somewhat. The part about the pipe organ that blows my mind is that other than just the the exquisite beauty and the profound engineering that goes into them, into the older ones, is that some of the tones are not even audible.
Right.
So what's going on there?
Yeah. Yeah, that's it.
They're in you know, with the skilled organist. You know, isn't it interesting that at least for me, like when I picture a pipe organ in church, it's like what comes to mind are like old movies and old cartoons where it's some like, you know, demonic dude or vampire,
like a villain or somebody who's
villainous character that's like dun 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 dun.
Right.
So what did they flip on us?
That's the propaganda, man. Yeah. Yes. Why are they showing us only one side where only evil, creepy guys use pipe organs? There's got to be something. Yeah. I can say, you know, growing up with this Catholic sort of Sunday, every Sunday we'd go to church. That was the only part I enjoyed was the music, because I don't know how. I don't think we had like a medieval pipe organ or anything like that, but it was fairly big piano. It was in a balcony in the back of the church, so that sound echoed throughout the church, and it was quite an experience. I think I was a little bit jaded at the time, you know, didn't really appreciate what was going on there, but it might have had an effect on me, you know. I did kind of become a moral person, you know. I didn't like stray from like, you know, I've never been arrested and never done anything criminal, so it must have had a positive impact in some way.
No, I think so. And then, you know, that's the positive side of like having grown Catholic, is like I grew up with a moral code, and even for, you know, when I considered myself an atheist for 20 years, I carried that code with me, and you know, that's when I developed into an architect during that period where I considered myself an atheist. But, you know, the idea of that houses could be more than, you know, just boxes, you know, that came from going to church and just looking up at these vaulted ceilings, and like yourself, like just listening to the organ play. So imagine like you get to grow up, you know, participating in mass in some, you know, cathedral with this pipe organ with tens of thousands of tones to it, and, you know, this stained glass rose window hovering above you. It just must be just such a profound way to come into your own humanity.
Now, you mentioned Tanya Harris, and I've had David Elkington on the show before talking about the, you know, sacred sound that seems to be almost like it imprints itself on the architecture itself. And I'm wondering if maybe there are certain like stratas that would hold sound better, like this cement. Would that have been, because, you know, you got to imagine that this old world cement, once it solidifies, it's like one solid piece. It's like one giant megalithic stone to some extent. And we've had a conversation, which I think you mentioned listening to, with Topher, where he talks about how the old world structures were built with polymers, geopolymers, that, you know, they would pour into place just like a cement, you know, a very advanced cement.
Yes. Yeah, you'd have to imagine that these structures hold the energy from what's going on inside of them.
Right.
You'd have to conclude that. I know. Absolutely. And so it's the container and the contained, right? And it's the eye and the eye. It's the you know, the greater consciousness, and then your own individual consciousness, or the you know, the spirit and the soul. I think there's this constant dialectic between you know, the mind of the user, and then, you know, if we could extrapolate to the mind of the of our container, of our environment.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's something that has been increasingly fascinating for me, going out and looking for these stone structures out in the woods and seeing where we can connect the dots, because it's almost like that, these individual buildings are connected to each other in a larger energy relationship where maybe they're passing energy through one another, just like those cities are all on the same ley line.
Yeah. Well, that gets right into what Tesla was doing. It seems with his Tesla towers and Wardenclyffe, and there's this cat. This dude Parker Edmondson?
That sounds familiar, but no, I don't know much about him. Tell me about him.
Check him out on YouTube, man. He puts up these 3-minute videos.
Yes, okay, yes. I think Andreas Zertis told me about him.
Yeah, and he's actually building these things, and it's just wrapping a bunch of wire that it seems like he found and stripped down to the copper and just wrapped it around a bunch of old 2x4s that he put up in his backyard, and he's sending electrical signals from his house to his friend's house, however many miles away.
Right.
And he's doing the calculations. This guy is a genius.
Yeah, he's definitely a savant. I saw some of his backyard devices. He's got this big turbine that spins and generates electricity and then transmits it throughout this network. Yeah.
So, if he's doing that in his backyard, imagine what these old buildings were doing. If it really has all this kind of old world tech that we're talking about, that's connecting it somehow to etheric energies, and you place several of these structures along these ley lines, one can only imagine the types of transmission and reception that was going on between them.
Right. Right, and this is the integrated approach that we need. For too long we've compartmentalized everything to where architects were only architects. They didn't think about the health of the people living inside of the building. Maybe if we look further back, there was a time when they did that, but it seems at least in the past 100, 200 years, there's become, this compartmentalization of things where it's not holistic. It's not accounting for the whole. So it's really encouraging to meet someone like yourself who is spreading this and demonstrating it and has the career that backs it up too, because this isn't like a hobby of yours. This is something that you do professionally. You're a designer. You've gone to school for architecture, and people can even hit you up and get a design from you, right? dreamdesignbuild.org is one of your websites, correct?
That's it. Yeah. I'd be happy to talk to anybody about design projects. And just a final note to what you're saying there is architects for too long have just kind of followed with the program, and maybe I've learned to follow my intuition over the years, and I think that the profession as such didn't resonate with me. And every time I've, worked with this or that architect, even working on schools, there's something that just pushed me away. And so I gravitated towards what I'm doing now, just by following my intuition. And I think that's what's going to be needed moving forward to really, to create a new story for ourselves, and to build a new cosmology, and then the sky's the limit. It's incredibly exciting for me to be, wearing the hat that I'm wearing now, because I get to build cool houses and just design round structures for amazing people. But where it goes, I have no idea. I'm just excited about the prospects, and if anybody is interested in talking shop, they can find me through that website, dreamdesignbuild.org. I also just launched a personal website. It's just gotten started, but it's for my more personal projects, like just backyard scrapwood chicken coop that I built, in a tiny house that I built in my driveway. things that don't make it to my professional website, but other interests. And, I'll be hopefully writing about some of these ideas that, are just kind of percolating right now and things we've been talking about. And so that is at MatthewRSmith.art.
Yes, and those links will be in the description for everybody. But yeah, I'm excited to see you catalog more of these old world concepts, the cement to the red bricks, and taking your professional eye to these things that are becoming very popular online, under maybe different sort of names. The T word, I like that. I think old world is more appropriate, and it's where I've been fascinated for my whole life. What happened in the past. It's one of the big reasons why I'm very grateful to have grandparents that are still alive, because I can go and ask them. And two of my grandparents are a little younger than the other two grandparents. So it's interesting to see the difference in perspective generationally, just for from 70-year-old to 90-year-old, right? It's totally different. And
wow, you're lucky that you have both sets of grandparents around.
Yeah, my Pepe passed away, but I was with him for long enough to really my grandparents lived next block over, so I grew up with them in my life consistently. So yeah, it's always been an interest of mine to go back and look and see what happened in history, and it seems like there's a resurgence of that interest, and hopefully that'll lead to more data that we can all look through and come to our own conclusions, because that's what it is. We've got a lot of data points, and we've been told this one narrative, and these data points don't fit into that narrative. So it's about time we start to get rid of these narratives and start just figuring out what the truth is, right?
Yeah, that's it. And I think that, we're feeling our way forward. I don't have any big answers. I think I have a lot of good questions, and again, following my intuition and what feels true.
Do you plan on, you said you planned on writing some stuff. Do you plan on making a podcast or any, a YouTube channel to contain some of these ideas? Obviously, you want to get on more podcasts, and I'd be happy to help you do that. And anyone listening who has a podcast, don't hesitate. Get in touch with Matt, especially if you've listened this far.
Well, thank you, Mark. I love the opportunity to talk to people about this. I probably don't have the bandwidth to be a podcaster. I have a lot of respect for what you're doing. I know it's a full-time job. And, so piggybacking on the good work that you and others are doing, that would be great. And again, it's, I'm not pitching a book. I don't have things figured out. I was looking into my research up until the time we talked, and it's just ideas are coming. Ideas are coming, and some big ones. And this idea of the piezoelectric generator, it's wow, certain ideas are clicking and fitting into a bigger, picture that's starting to crystallize. So I'm just excited to be part of the conversation at this point.
Agreed. It is exciting, and I'm excited to add another friend to the group here. I mean, thank you, Matt, for joining me here and sharing your unique insights with us. And yeah, it's been a true blast to the past, so to speak, getting into all these ideas. And I look forward to having you back on again. My throat, I don't know if you noticed, I'm a little scratchy today. I'm not feeling tip-top shape, but I'm on the edge curve of that, so I'm feeling better than I did yesterday. So
the seasons are changing.
Yeah, here's to our continued health. And Matt, thank you, brother, for joining me here. Like I said, all your links are in the description, folks. Please follow up with him, and especially if you'd like a design, if you want to maybe find a new place to live, think about hitting Matt up and see what you guys could do together. But until next time, thank you for tuning in, and enjoy the moment wherever you are in the now.
So we've had a good couple of weeks of shows. you know?
Mark is doing a great job, even though he drives me fucking nuts sometimes.
He's great. No, he's done a great job.
He's done a great job.
Good job, Mark.
You can call me Mark Palmer. Mark Palmer's cool.
Mark Palmer's...
It's a beautiful day to be alive. Motherfuckers, it's a beautiful day. Beautiful day. It's a beautiful day to be alive.
That's all I gotta say, dude. I don't think it's about money. I think they have so much. It's just about... It's a spiritual war, dude. It's so much farther.
There's more power in spring flowers than pseudo-intellectuals fueled by hate with the face sour. When it comes to the hour of reckoning, recollect, reconnect with days happening. Yeah, are you frowning or laughing? Are you making the grade or barely passing? Caught in the asinine like the afterlife. Obsessed with darkness, have you mastered light? Cause it's faster than a blink. When it's a bastard, latch to the clink, clang. The money don't mean a damn thing. Think, happiness ain't coming from the bank, dang. I'm out here daydreaming. The spirit's the egg, the self is the semen. And that's cause life is the child, and it takes a village to give it the illest style. So, if your family think you crazy, and you ain't got a village, know you always got a place here. Come kick it, we chillin'.
Exactly, dude. You get it, bro. You're so smart, everybody. You're so smart.
Feel like I'm waking up for the first time. Krusty's on my third eye, but I'm back to the grind. Pop the blinds open, let the sun shine. Feel it on my skin like it's been sometimes. Sometimes depression got me plaguing like Sisyphus. Others got me messing with mania like Icarus. And meditation helps with the sickness. Some say it's human condition, but it just isn't. There's more power in spring flowers. The circular thoughts that leave the mind devoured. Blurred lines between reality and fiction. And some politicians get dirtier than dishes. But for a minute, just forget about the government. I'm looking at you and I and where the love went. Cause we don't need a fucking village full of cynics. Need a family to foster a life worth living if it isn't. And your family think you crazy, yeah. And you ain't got a village. I know you always got a place here. Come kick it, we chillin', yeah.
I'm a conspiracy boy.
Motherfuckers.
I'm a conspiracy boy.
Motherfuckers.
Yeah. I'm a psychic. I'm a prophet, bro. Why are you questioning that?
Yeah. It's a beautiful day. Beautiful day.
I never trust a dude in a sweater. That's all I gotta say, dude. Mark Palmer's cool. How are you, brother?
I'm great, man. How are you?